Marvel Cinematic Universe Phase 2. After the roaring success of the first Avengers, Kevin Feige didn't just sit back and bask in his victory. In fact, quite the opposite. He decided to go and make 6 more films that were each improvements, for the most part, on their predecessors, taking what he had learned and only improving the MCU even more. This was truly the expansion of not only the characters and the story, but the boldness of the creators to really go out there and tell new stories in bigger and better ways. To introduce characters like Ant-Man and Guardians of the Galaxy. To have a talking tree and a raccoon, and have the audiences love them all the same. Marvel Phase 2 was the story of risks. They started with a bang in Iron Man 3, and for better or for worse, they decided to subvert all of our expectations with the Mandarin twist. I don't know if they realized at the time what kind of dent this would have on their fan base, because here we are in 2020, and Kevin Feige is still promising us the real Mandarin. We moved to The Winter Soldier, which took Captain America in a completely different direction. The action was grittier, the tone was bleaker, and this film wasn't afraid to pull its punches. Not a single bit. Because Marvel knew that now these characters were established, they could go places with them, really exploring the psychological aspects of all of them. And then we have Guardians and Ant-Man, introducing all new characters into the MCU that would become mainstays for years to come. But they didn't know it at the time. At the time, people legitimately thought that these projects had a huge downside to them, a chance to fail. But Marvel held their ground. They didn't budge, and they continued to push forward the envelope. Strangely enough, though, mixed in with these 4 risk-taking films, we have a couple that are almost the safest in the entire MCU, with Thor: The Dark World and Age of Ultron. While the other 4 films attempted to push the boundaries of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in some way, Thor: The Dark World was generic in almost every sense of the word, and Age of Ultron was an ultimately hollow, entertaining attempt to replicate the success of the first Avengers. What didn't change, though, was the dedication to quality. Throughout each one of these films, there was still the trademark Marvel style, something that we've gotten to love over the years. This was Marvel at its peak, especially in 2014, when they had finally clicked with the audiences on a deeper level than just entertaining blockbusters. And most of all, this phase of 6 films gave them the launching pad that they needed to head into Phase 3, where they really were able to pay off a lot of these ideas. Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World are perhaps not the best MCU films by any stretch of the imagination, but they were continuations of what had come before. Iron Man 3 saw Tony dealing with the aftermath of the Battle of New York, and what that meant for him moving forward. We saw the evolution of Tony Stark as he continued down the path that would lead him to Endgame. And that's what's so brilliant about this phase, because you can really view the MCU Infinity Saga as a giant 3-act film. The first act, or Phase 1, was setting up these characters. You have Tony, who learns to let go of his selfish ego that has driven him for so long and help the world in a meaningful way. But after New York, he doubts that he can, and he begins to turn inwards, building suits, 42 of them, and building Ultron, trying so desperately to stave off a future that he knows is inevitable, which will be expanded upon later in Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame. Steve Rogers is a soldier. He's a warrior, a fighter, a believer in patriotism. But what happens when the government that he's set out to protect fails him? Where does he go from there? All of a sudden, he's left with these misgivings about the government, which will ride into Civil War and a split with Tony. Even Thor has a lot of development in this phase. In the first phase of the MCU, he was an arrogant, narrow-minded, narrow-sighted prince who slowly learned to broaden his horizons and see more. We see in Age of Ultron that he really is beginning to get a bigger, clearer picture of what lies in front of him in Ragnarok and Infinity War. This truly was the beginning of the Thor that had become so prominent in Phase 3 and beyond into Phase 4. As for the villains, well, we're getting there. It's not until Phase 3 that we get to see a lot of new villains shine, but for now, we'll have to do with hit and miss. Aldrich Killian and Darren Cross certainly weren't terrible, and there were some attempts to make them more sympathetic to the audience, unlike some villains in Phase 1. As for Ronan and Malekith, perhaps it's best to forget about them. But we saw glimpses of something more, with Alexander Pierce and Ultron, villains with layers, complexity to them that was matched by a charismatic performance. This was the first true glimpse into what Marvel had the potential to do in Phase 3 with their villains, and they really delivered on the promise of that with Thanos. To me, Phase 2 represents a sort of growing up for the MCU, a maturity, if you will. There will be mistakes made along the way, and goodness knows that we could have done away with some of the parts of some of these films. But without Phase 2, which built upon the foundations of Phase 1, the MCU wouldn't have been emboldened to go into new, different, greater directions. To take new characters and just be bold with them. To not care about what people would think about them, but just deliver the best product for the audiences. And you know what? At the end of the day, I can sit back and say that I legitimately would enjoy watching any of these movies again. Because while some of these stories may or may not have been as good as those in Phase 1, the characters have matured. They've grown. If you think of the MCU like a TV series, this is Season 2, where you enjoy the characters more and you really begin to see their growth. And thus, despite a lack of quality in certain scenes and certain stories, you're still there for the characters. I'd much rather see the Thor in Phase 2 than the Thor from Phase 1, even though Thor the Dark World isn't necessarily the best film. And same with Loki. Phase 2 was a statement of assertion, a next step of confidence that Marvel was going to take. You can see with each and every movie their confidence begins to grow, and they begin to think bolder, newer, bigger, and better. And that will lead us to truly great things in Phase 3. But we'll get to that someday. After, another 11 reviews. Comment down below with your favorite Phase 2 movie. Civil War is right around the corner, so stay tuned for that review coming very soon. In the meantime, subscribe to stay notified and give this video a like to support the channel. If you want to check out more videos, then make sure to click on the videos on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.